We have a panel of 4 speakers, each of whom are going to be giving us different perspectives on the build-up to the 1913 Ancient Monuments Act, how it made its way onto the statute book, what happens when we set that act in a wider international comparative context, what factors other than the act itself may have shaped the history of heritage protection in the first half of the 20th century and beyond, and what came legislatively after the 1913 Act, and how that then influenced thinking about how heritage protection changed and developed in the subsequent decades. Now, so that we can stick to our schedule and ensure that we've got plenty of time for questions afterwards, we suggest that we take the 4 presentations in running order. Each speaker will have 15 minutes, and then we'll open up to the floor afterwards. By all means, feel free to respond to individual papers, but it would be really good to have some questions that might connect the papers together and open up some wider cross-cutting themes. So the batting order is as follows. First up is going to be Ben Cowell, who's going to speak on the National Trust and the 1913 Ancient Monuments Act. Ben is Director for the East of England region of the National Trust. He's Deputy Chair and Trustee of the Heritage Alliance, and he's author of a history of the heritage movement entitled The Heritage Obsession, The Battle for England's Past, as well as a biography of one of the founders and the first chairman of the National Trust, Sir Robert Hunter, who will figure in his presentation today. Second, we have Dr. Astrid Swenson, who's going to be speaking on the genesis of the 1913 Act, putting it in an international context for us. Astrid is lecturer in European history at Brunel University, and her publications include From Plunder to Preservation, Britain and the Heritage of Empire, which she's co-edited with Peter Mandel, who's present today, and it looks at this book looks at the impact of empire on the idea of heritage. And also she's got a forthcoming book with Cambridge University Press on the rise of heritage, preserving the past in France, Germany and England, 1789 to 1914. Third, we have Professor Henry French from the University of Exeter, who is speaking on 1913 or 1910, heritage trajectories in the 20th century case study. Henry is Professor of Social History and Head of Department at our own University at Exeter. His research is focused on long-term processes of social change and the evolution of social identity, including a book entitled The Social Order of England, 1600 to 1800. He's also, since 2009, interestingly, been involved with the Poltimore House Trust in Devon, researching the history of that house and its development, working with the local community, including a 300-strong team of volunteers to improve public understanding of the building and surrounding landscape. Finally, we'll hear from Malcolm Ayres, who's going to be speaking on the development of the conservation profession. Malcolm is an architectural historian who specialised in the early modern period, but previously worked in local government and then as a conservation officer with South Oxfordshire District Council. He's now Emeritus Professor of Conservation and the Historic Environment in Oxford University's Department for Continuing Education. He served on advisory committees for English Heritage, the National Trust and the Heritage Lottery Fund, and he's currently President of the Society of Architectural Historians of Great Britain. So 4 great speakers and great topics, and over to there to start.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Andrew. Thanks to you all. I should probably say that my title ought probably to be the National Trust and the Ancient Monument Acts, because as Simon has pointed out this morning, there were previous acts to the 1913 Act, some of which will feature in my talk this morning. There are no slides, that's a lovely picture anyway, situation. I'm going to start, if I may, with a story that I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, know all too well and know far better than I do. On the eve of the 20th century, New Year's Eve 1900, a Sarsen upright at Stonehenge, along with its lintel, fell in a storm. Considerable damage was caused, and concerns were raised about the safety of the entire monument. The following year, Professor William Gowland was commissioned to carry out an archaeological investigation into one of the largest uprights at Stonehenge, which was Leaning. Gowland's study was enormously important in producing some of the first scientific data about Stonehenge. And Gowland also oversaw the straightening and setting of the stone in concrete. Now, at the time, of course, Stonehenge was in private hands. Having said that, there had been a long tradition of public access to the monument by tourists. This dates back to at least the time of James I. But in 1901, the landowner at Stonehenge, Sir Edmund Andrewes, also took the opportunity of the work that was being carried out there to enclose Stonehenge behind a fence, and then to charge an admission price of 1 shilling. Now, this act of enclosure provoked a huge row. On the one side were Sir Edmund and the private owners of historic monuments, keen to ensure their private property was not officially subsumed as part of the national collective inheritance. On the other were the various groups active in the late 19th century and early 20th century in the defence of open land and freedom of access. And we've heard from Simon about some of these already. Among them were, of course, the National Trust, which was formed in 1895, but also importantly the Commons Preservation Society, founded 30 years earlier in 1865 by George Shaw Lefevre, who was also a Curtis lawyer. One of the National Trust founders was Sir Robert Hunter. Now, Hunter had served as solicitor to the Commons Preservation Society from 1868 until 1882, when he was promoted to the post of solicitor to the General Post Office under Gladstone's second ministry. In 1902, while still serving in the Post Office, but by which time he was, of course, the first chairman of the National Trust, Hunter wrote an article in the journal The 19th Century about the enclosure of Stonehenge. And he did not mince his words. I'm suddenly nervous reading these out in the particular surroundings we were in this morning. He wrote, "Those who would surround Stonehenge with barbed wire and filter the nation through a toll gate are the men who cannot rise from the details and measurements to the conception of a monument as a whole. Men who, in another connection, would delight to pick a flower to pieces and explain its parts, but could not appreciate its beauty of form and colour when alive. The work of such antiquaries is most valuable, but there is no life in it. To men such as those who treat Stonehenge as a mere curiosity, to be boxed up, examined, and ticketed, who will assume that it stood on a private lawn, as on Salisbury Plain, it is due that the study of antiquities has been voted a dreary science." Apologies. One might read from this that Hunter was putting himself firmly on the side of those who prioritise access over protection. Why protect a monument if no one can see it? But in fact, Hunter was desperately concerned about Stonehenge's condition and its conservation. He went on to explain that the National Trust, at the suggestion of General Pitt Rivers no less, had offered some years ago to use its influence, a phrase that Hunter often used at this time, to induce the state to undertake such works as were expedient to save the stones from falling. The call had fallen on deaf ears, but enclosure was not one of those options the Trust had proposed for protecting the stones. After all, as Hunter put it, there was little a barbed wire fence some distance away could do to prevent the stones from falling. Hunter demonstrated in his article there was undeniably public right of access to and across the site of Stonehenge, and that its enclosure was therefore a gross act of aggression against the public. Hunter's solution was that Stonehenge should obviously be in the possession and guardianship of the nation. Only the state could afford the regular maintenance, upkeep, and research and analysis that the site required. Stonehenge could no more be considered strictly private property when it was inhabited. And the attempt by Antipas to repel visitors was doomed to fail, given the significance of Stonehenge to the nation. The recent enclosure, he wrote, will prove to be a blessing in disguise, if it leads to a more formal transfer of Stonehenge to the care of the nation. But the barbed wires must be removed and the harmony of the monument and its surroundings restored. We're going to be getting there at the present day at last. This episode at Stonehenge at the turn of the 20th century seems to epitomise so much of what this conference aims to debate. The desire for access is pitched against the necessity of conservation and the demands of scientific investigation. The responsibilities of the state are tested against the boundaries of what could reasonably be considered the duties of private individuals. Yet it's too easy to overgeneralise about the positions of the various actors in these debates, both historically and today. While in the saga of Stonehenge's enclosure, the National Trust is often depicted as being on the side of the footpath lobby, a very important lobby at that time, Hunter's article demonstrates perhaps a more sophisticated reading. The Trust, if Hunter is to be taken at face value, had in fact been agitating for more state control over Stonehenge, in the interests of both conservation and access. A happy medium could be struck, but it involved the government stepping in to foot the bill. So part of what I want to say, therefore, is that it would be a mistake to assume that the various stakeholders in this debate can be ranged against each other on lines that we recognise all too easily today: private versus public, charity versus government, built versus natural heritage. And I think in many ways this is personifying the figure of Robert Hunter. Hunter himself was a civil servant. In fact, as the solicitor to the General Post Office, which at that time was a government department, a department of state, he was in fact one of the most senior civil servants in the country. And that set him apart from the other founders of the National Trust. Famously, Octavia Hill turned down any government appointment. She kept herself as a campaigner her entire life and career. Hunter was a civil servant during the day and a campaigner for monuments and for open spaces at night. He was, in fact, if you like, a man from the ministry, just a different one from the ministry we've been hearing about this morning. And he had a huge personal influence on the development and the founding of the early National Trust. In many ways, the trust was his invention. The concept of a legal, independent trust created with the explicit aim of owning land on behalf of the nation had emerged from discussions Hunter had been having with Octavia Hill over the rescuing of Sayes Court Gardens in Deptford in 1884. Hunter had elaborated on his idea in a series of lectures and began discussing its application in the Lake District with Canon Hardwick Walmsley. But it would be wrong to assume that the Trust in its early years was exclusively concerned with open spaces, even if that was often the main topic of discussion. Buildings featured among the earliest acquisitions of the National Trust, places like Alfriston Clergy House and Tintagel Post Office. At the same time as Hunter was setting up and leading the National Trust, he pursued his interest in historic architecture of all kinds, intervening to join campaigns to save the historic buildings of Whitehall and the Jeffrey Almshouses in Shoreditch. And the earliest annual reports of the National Trust demonstrate this point. The annual report for the very first year of the Trust in 1895 related the concerns of the Executive Committee as to the impotency of the existing law to adequately protect such national monuments as Stonehenge and the Antonine Wall. Such was the concern and the delicacy of the issues at stake that a special committee was set up to examine the whole question of how you protect monuments. This is in 1895 as reported. And that committee boasted not only the three founders of the National Trust, Octavia Hill, Robert Hunter and Hardwick Walmsley, but also figures that we've heard about this morning, another, James Bryce, the campaigner for open access to the mountains and gardens, General Pitt Rivers, and indeed George Shaw Lefevre of the Commons Preservation Society. Just 2 years later, in its third annual report, the Trust was reporting that there are many indications of the jealousy or misunderstanding of government interposition on behalf of preservation of historic buildings as public monuments is gradually giving way. But still, the 1882 Act at this time, of course, remained the only power and restricted to prehistoric sites only. A detailed annex to the annual report for the National Trust, prepared by Hunter, contrasted the situation in Great Britain with that in other European countries, and in America and in Canada. Britain was considered wanting, as no doubt we'll hear from Astrid shortly. Such was Hunter's personal interest in the subject of monument protection that he was called upon to help shape successive Acts of Parliament, the Ancient Monuments Acts. In 1900, he was asked by Lord Avebury to draft at least one clause of the bill of that year, because it was better, as was written in a letter to Hunter, to ask Hunter to do so than have the drafting entrusted to the Office of Works. The Trust's annual report for 1900 goes further and proclaims that Avebury's Ancient Monuments Bill, which became the law that year, was indeed drafted by Sir Robert Hunter. And the scandal of the removal of the Tattershall Castle fireplaces, as we've heard, provoked a fresh round of agitation by the Trust for new legislation. And once more, Hunter was in the lead, writing to the Times in 1911 to argue that the Tattershall disaster, as it was perceived, could again prove a blessing in disguise for heritage, if it meant that it supplied the motive power necessary to carry the measure through Parliament. The Trust, under Hunter, drafted a fresh Monuments Bill, one of these bills that was introduced in 1913, proposing the creation of an advisory board of commissioners of works and conferring new suspensory powers on the commissioners to protect monuments. Other bills of a similar nature were, of course, in circulation, one prepared by Noel Buxton, MP, for the SPAB. But the Trust was sufficiently emboldened to declare in their annual report for the following year that the 1913 Act was largely as a result of their efforts. To conclude, it might be relevant to observe that the movement for environmental protection, whether open spaces or monuments, was driven in these years by an explicitly liberal, with a capital L, political agenda. The agitation for the protection of common land in the 1860s and 70s took place with the endorsement and indeed active encouragement of members of Gladstone's government, among them Henry Fawcett, the Postmaster General, who had appointed Hunter to his position at the GBO. The first Ancient Monuments Act of 1882 marks the early years of Gladstone's second term in office. Robert Hunter owed his success in his career to the patronage of prominent groups like Fawcett and indeed Shaw Everett, and was able to pass the National Trust Act of 1907 under the aegis of the Liberal government of the day. So this political association of early preservation movements with political liberalism, I think, will be an area worthy of much closer study, as Michael Roberts has demonstrated recently in the English Historical Review. But for me, the interesting question is not so much the party political affiliations of early preservation, but how protection itself came to occupy such a dominant place in political culture at all in the second half of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th. Thereafter, as we know, preservation became an increasingly minority interest among the political elite. And after the Second World War, it became much more difficult to argue the case for the value of protection per se. Political narratives were instead dominated by modernist tropes of rebuild, renewal, and regeneration. The heritage movement since the 1950s has struggled to get any purchase on the priorities of successive governments. That struggle continues today. Thank goodness, therefore, the foundations laid by the 1913 Act and the 1907 National Trust Act were of such a solid basis, and we have the foresight of these early pioneers to thank for it. But none were more important, I would argue, than Sir Robert Hunter. Hunter's concept of inalienability, denying the National Trust the chance to dispose of its inalienable estate without the explicit authority of Parliament, arguably created a form of state-sanctioned heritage protection that was the equal of anything in successive monument acts at that time. In other words, it was a public-private partnership of the sort. And it's a model that, more than a century later, has been copied the world over. Robert Hunter died in November 1913, just a few months after his retirement. post office. So for me, I think this conference stands as much to testimony to his legacy as it does to the Act of Parliament of 1913, but apparently he was so influential in shaping. Thank you.
Like Sir Robert Hunter, many of his contemporaries judged that, quote, by continental standards, the machinery for protecting our ancient monuments can only be called defective. That last quote is from Gerald Baldwin Brown's The Care of Ancient Monuments, probably the most extensive comparative study of preservation legislation in Britain, Europe, and the rest of the world at the time. But it was only one of many such texts, the first being the comparative studies compiled by Hunter for the National Trust, by the Society of Antiquaries, and then numerous publications in a variety of formats, in doctoral dissertations, international congress papers, but also in the pages of the major national and even local newspapers. Hence, the preservationists set up to close the gap between what they perceived was their own situation and better modules that could be emulated elsewhere in the world, and especially in Europe. Yet, in 1927, we could still read from a civil servant in the Office of Works that compared to the rest of Europe, Britain still had the lowest standard of preservation, with, as Ben has pointed out elsewhere, probably the exception of the Balkan states and Turkey, end quote. So what should we make of all these rather dismissive statements about the British situation and the idea that preservation was so much better elsewhere, and that especially the state's role was so much better elsewhere? In some ways, it is true that if we compare the British legislation, and especially the 1913 Act on its own, there is much less compulsion if we compare it to France or to the various laws in Germany. The budget is also much lower, again, especially if compared to France. There is no participatory model where members of the state bureaucracies, monument owners, are sitting together to make the decisions, and also the number of monuments that can be scheduled excluded, as we have heard, inhabited buildings and churches. Yet in many other ways, this is also not a very balanced comparison. Not only, as Ben already pointed out, does the picture become considerably more complex if we not only look at one act, but the totality of legislation, from the Ancient Monuments Act, the National Trust Act, town and county legislation, but also a lot of local bylaws that were in place and that ensure protection at various levels. But also what we can see when we look at it in a comparison is that everybody else also thought that they were lagging behind. So all the statements that we can read in the British press and the British publications, if we look at French, German, Italian, Danish, Spanish, Bulgarian, you name it, publication, we find exactly the same. And very often we can also read that Britain was a paradigm that should be emulated. So what I want to do very briefly here is to place the road to preservation, but also the act itself, within a much broader process of preservation legislation that was taking place in Europe, but also throughout the world, especially throughout colonial preservation, but also in North America and in Latin America. And what we can see if we place Britain in this broader perspective is, on the one hand, we see the similarities and the differences a little bit sharper, so we can really see what was unique about Britain and what was part of a much broader picture. But we can also see that international competition was actually a major force behind the rise of preservation. Let us begin with some of the differences. In many ways, the road to preservation is different because it is not so much started by the upheaval of revolution and the Napoleonic years and that reshuffling of property that has taken place. Hence, there are no early commissions that are put in place like in most countries on the continent in the 1840s. But there also are mainly differences in debates about whose monuments should be scheduled or listed by the state. Whereas on the continent, the debate focuses mainly on churches and on the property of communes, because there are tensions between the state and the church, but also about local and regional autonomy in increasingly centralizing national states. The debates in Parliament in Britain are mostly about aristocratic property and private property, which is of a much lesser concern across the continent. But apart from this, there are many, many similarities. First of all is the timing. As you can see from this by no means complete list, there are a few laws at the beginning of the 19th century. They are mainly passed in Italy, Greece, the Ottoman Empire, to prevent exportation of monuments. So, in other words, to prevent the other marvels from happening again. Whereas we then have this acceleration of legislation that is introduced from the very late 1860s, but really 1870s, 1880s, and then again another acceleration after 1900, where we have a situation where bills are introduced almost every couple of months. And we not only have a multiplication of bills, but we also have a multiplication of actors who are promoting these bills. So, whereas in the pre-1900 period, there are generally 2 or 3 different bills that are promoted either by somebody from the private sector, like in Britain, or from the state administration, like in France or Germany. We now have these competing bills from different actors, but also a much greater collaboration. Whereas in the first Ancient Monuments Act, like in Britain, in Europe, there was very little collaboration between different private associations and different ministers or people in the ministries. After 1900, there is a much greater consciousness that if preservation is to succeed, one needs collaboration of the different voluntary societies that already exist. There also is a multiplication of the heritages that should be protected. It is no longer just ancient monuments, but nature plays an increasingly important role. Open spaces, but also traditions are increasingly thought to be able to be protected by law. So there is already an idea that not just tangible, but also intangible heritages should be protected, even if these words are not yet used. What is also noticeable is that everywhere the bills that are promoted by the private sector, in many ways, go much further than what any state administration or any parliament wants to pass. And this is not just the case in Britain, but it's also especially the case in France and in Germany. Yet what I think is the most surprising similarity is this fact that everybody insists that they are lagging behind everybody else, and that their legislation is so inferior. Here we have another example. I was just past the same moment, same time. I was in France this weekend, and all over the country you could see for the European Heritage Days that it's celebrating the 100 years of protection, so their 1913 Ancient Monuments Law. So what everybody did was compile these comparative studies. It was not just Gordon Brown, it was not just Hunter, but there were numerous other ones, and here are just a few pictures of the literally hundreds of comparative analyses that were offered of better models abroad. So why does it work? Why does the argument that something is better somewhere else actually necessarily leads to emulation. And what is interesting here is that it did not work in the 1940s. The Select Committee of the House of Commons was, when it first discussed national monuments, was also presented with evidence of how they do things in France and how they do things in Germany. It had no effect. But in the period between 1970 and 1914, the preservation of monuments or of heritage more largely was increasingly portrayed as a measurement for civilization, or as one German preservationist put it, the cultural attainment of a people can be judged by the way it protects its monuments. It was also used as a significant difference between colonizers and colonized, and as good governance in the colonial, hence the very compulsory Ancient Monument Act that Lord Curzon passed in India. And this constant repetition of the need to catch up with other civilized nations, of the need to prove oneself to be ahead in that game of that mastery for the world that is happening before the First World War, that is a decisive factor behind the rise of preservation, not just in Britain, but all over the world. Hence, I think that it is not just bureaucratic measures that are put in place by the Act that are significant for the 20th century, although it is always, of course, very difficult to change bureaucratic logics once they are put in place. But it is really this belief that the state should care for heritage that is established through comparison, that is established through this race to be the most advanced, most civilized nation. And here we can see the real differences between the 1870s and the 1913, 1914. And in that speech that you quoted from Lord Curzon, when he asked himself what was all the fuss about, why was there so much opposition in the 1880s against the so modest bill that Lovell proposed, and that although there still was considerable opposition, and it was still only a small knot of cultivated people, to use William Morris's phrase to characterize the SPAB that promoted the law, and not a widespread concern shared by the nation. Yet it was also more and more established that actually government should be involved, and that the state should be involved, that left an important legacy for the 20th century. Hence, the debates are in many ways debates of their time. They are inscribed, on the one hand, in much bigger debates about the role of the state, the establishment of the welfare state at the time. They are also inscribed in an idea of an imperialist nation and of leading by example, but also by being better at preservation than the rest of the world. But they are also full of nuance, and they're also full of contemporary relevance. They're very concerned with ideas about access. They're very concerned with ideas about diversity, even if their idea of diversity is not ours. They're also very nuanced in their approach to government and the necessity to have something that outlasts one generation and one fashion, and something that is there in perpetuity, and to ensure this through government legislation, government agencies, but also through the national trust legislation. But they are also very conscious of the problems involved in scheduling or listing, and the idea that you cannot, on the one hand, one can never list enough, but one can also always list too much, and that it is impossible to list every monument that deserves protection, because otherwise no development is possible and simply the funds are not available. But there also are a lot of debates about how one can actually adjust to changing needs, to changing fashions, to either have a 30-year period elapsed, but also always having this idea of needing to revisit what is relevant. And in this sense, the debates have not changed very much. And finally, they are also quite savvy when it comes to the idea of impact and of being, having a preservationist discourse that is more broadly relevant. In one of, I think, the most lucid passages of Godwin's Brown's Care of Ancient Monuments, he talks about the fact that if we care about ancient monuments, the question of preservation and preservation legislation is settled for us. But then he continues, but we cannot make others aware to the charm of monuments. For the mass of mankind, a yellow primrose by a river's brim set in water will always be just a yellow primrose. And then he goes on, but there are more practical arguments that can convince the least antiquarian among the population. His conclusion then is to launch into economic and imperial arguments. I think our discourses have changed, but I think it's a good reminder to think that even then, when it was just a very small group of people who thought to speak for the nation, they were aware of how to make this debate relevant and important for the nation as a whole.
Okay, right. I've reached that zen-like stage of not worrying about technological disasters, having spent an extra hour on the train this morning, so if there was some students with anything electrical today, so if the microphone's cut out, then you'll know. Thank you very much for inviting me today. I should point out, before you realise, that I'm not an expert really on the 20th century, on heritage, or indeed the 1913 Act. Why am I here, you ask? Well, the answer is, I suppose, I wanted to sort of talk about a little bit of an area of research of mine, which is on, I suppose, some of the other aspects in that period, particularly in relation to landed estates. As we've heard from Astrid, Ben, it's important to think about some of the context in which the 1913 Act was produced, and also, in a sense, the ways in which it fits within much wider debates at the time, not just about heritage, but in a sense, we need to understand some of those debates in order to understand perhaps why there was so much heritage up for grabs, why there was so many historic sites, why there were so many historic buildings that came to be in need of preservation, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, why so many of them were not preserved and saved, and where that sort of push comes from. So, just in terms of the legislative background, obviously you've heard this morning about the 1913 Act and the way that it involved its scheduling of outstanding sites, two rather loaded words there, both outstanding because that had to be defined, and as we've seen, even when those definitions were forthcoming, the money turned on the preservation was often not from Parliament, and then also sites, that we're not talking primarily about inhabited buildings or churches, as we've heard. And that, in a sense, the focus was very much on archaeological sites, ancient monuments, not on what has come to characterise perhaps the second half of the 20th and 21st centuries, an emphasis on 18th, 19th, 20th century buildings. So those were not really within the remit. And then we have a number of other pieces of legislation that, before, I think, World War II, should we say, strengthen the arm of those who want to encourage voluntary preservation, so building preservation was in 1932, the National Trust Act as well, and then also the more widespread idea of listing buildings in 1944, and then the 47 Country Planning Act, which has a slightly anomalous situation where alterations to listed buildings are illegal but demolition is not. Which I think is, when one thinks about the context of 1947, we have a large building stock, which is, of course, in many cases very heavily bombed and is not necessarily easy to preserve or rebuild. And then perhaps, it's interesting, perhaps deliberate, that the conference goes between 1913 and 1953 with the Historic Buildings and Ancient Monuments Act. And part one of that, it establishes a sort of regulatory regime which is more familiar. It's changed in the last 20 years, but it's more familiar to us perhaps than the historic building councils. The money for conservation repairs from government grants to the National Trust for acquisition of new buildings. So that, in a sense, bookends the period that I want to talk about and shows, in a sense, this movement from creating a legislative framework in which, if you like, the government could encourage and solicit preservation to one in which it takes a more active role in funding some of that preservation and also in deciding what should and should not be preserved. So, against that background, I also want to think about some of the other things that were going on in the very fraught decade before World War I. And in doing so, I want to think about that 1910 budget, as we've heard, I think very interestingly, and as Michael Roberts has also suggested. It's important to think about the debates of 1913, the lead up to 1913, within wider questions, both questions about open access to land, questions about the debates about the land question in the late 19th and 20th centuries, particularly because they became obviously involved in debates about elite power within the period, and as a result of that, both around things like the 1909 budget, obviously the 1910 Act about House of Lords, 1911 House of Lords Act, sorry, and also about the role of the government in welfare and other areas like that. The increasing role of the state as arbiter. Is the state merely an arbiter? Is it actually something? Should it have organs that intervene more actively, preserve, conserve, and particularly to tell private owners what to do? And obviously, this is where, in the context of liberalism in the early 20th century, you have those strains of activism, civic activism, and the desire for increased welfare spending, alongside existing traditions of liberalism, which is basically to leave the owner in charge of many of these things. So, in terms of the background, why is there so much heritage up for grabs in the decade after 1909? Well, some of this is relevant. The People's Budget, obviously, trying to fund many of the things to change the welfare through things like incremental value duty, which is a tax on the windfall profits of suburban housing and mineral rights, which is really designed to get at large landowners. And then also, alongside that, the increased death duties and super tax. So, in a sense, the rather complacent remarks of people in the run to 1913 about the capacity of landowners and those who own these buildings to know best their preservation was being undermined in the 3 or 4 years before World War I by these changes. And I think they have significant effects. Some of those effects perhaps have been slightly overstated, but they are important nonetheless. Incremental value duty fails, primarily because they can never work out the valuations properly in order then to work out how much the value increase. Interest rates rise as a result of World War I, which obviously has a big effect on those aristocratic landowners and others with big mortgages. Death duties rise from 15% to 40%, and super tax was levied on all incomes of above £10,000 a year. And then you've also got increased farm incomes, but not increased in rents. So you do actually have an increase in land values as a result of that. So all of those things mean that landowners have a greater imperative to sell, and they have a greater desire to sell. The land market takes off from about 1910 till 1925 or so, and that's the first time in more than a generation that the value of land has increased, and so more properties, more landed properties, and so on, come onto the market, and with those come historic buildings as well. And so some of in a sense, the failures of the interwar period become clear in this era, because an awful lot of properties come up for preservation and cannot be preserved. And I wanted to just spend a little bit of time giving you an example of those. Now, both of these properties sort of fall outside, very much outside the remit of the 1913 Act, and as we shall see, at least one of them falls through the remits of apparently every piece of legislation designed to preserve a property of some merit, if not necessarily outstanding merit. So I want to talk about these two families, Devon's Montagues and Capulets, you might call them, the Aclands and the Bampfiles. Never an Acland married a Bampfile, never a Bampfile married an Acland, as far as I can see, even though their estates bordered each other for the best part of 400 years. So I want to look at the experience of those two families. Now, the Aclands, I think, have been the subject of considerable recent research, if not anywhere else in Adam Nicholson's book recently on the gentry, because of their role in particularly giving their lands to the National Trust. Now, it's interesting, as we've heard, to think about the desire for preservation, or the desire to change land holding in the context of a political background. The Aclands through the 19th century sort of followed Gladstone's journey from the Tory party to the Liberals. But Arthur Acland, the second son who inherited it eventually in 1919, was a much more advanced liberal politician, and was also very suspicious of what he called the Acland tradition, this sort of feudal tradition of requiring everyone to go to church on Sunday, keeping everyone in line on the estate, and so on. He wrote that in his diary in 1882. He looked around the estate, in a sense, with different eyes. He was looking at it from outside, and this dislike of land, of the concept of land in society, fills the Acland family from that point, including his son there, Francis, who's in the glasses on the left. They're listening to Lloyd George at Killerton in 1925. Lloyd George, 1925, land proposals then. And again, Acland says, it'd be jolly if we taxed so heavily that we have to sell Killerton. There would be some chance of peace and simplicity and really loving each other. Sort of think of someone with a lot of money imagining not having much money. But it's interesting that this connection between liberal politics and the desire to rid themselves, not just of the encumbrance of a large and expensive house, which I think many landowners probably felt in the first decade of the 20th century. There is, if you like, a point of principle behind it, a point of principle which comes into a desire to reform land estates, to tax the land estate out of existence in many respects. And that leads into the Aclands' involvement in sort of liberal politics, particularly the first Liberal administration after 1906. They're actually more involved in education and welfare. But it's interesting that this is in direct response to Lloyd George's budget in 1909 and the things that followed from that. Now, the Aclands were also involved very early in the giving particularly on Exmoor. And it's interesting that this praise coming from Lord Portsmouth here is in the Times of 1917. Portsmouth, of course, writes in opposition to the 1913 Act, saying we shouldn't compel landowners to do things. But when landowners voluntarily do things like this, giving a large amount of property to the National Trust, then this is a good thing. It's interesting to note that this is guardianship. All it does, in a sense, is to vest the National Trust in as sort of trustees to stop any future members of the Acland family trying to build on the land. It doesn't really seem to do much else. It just prevents building. It reserves the rents and profits of the estate there as well. So it's perhaps less generous than it first appears. And as I say, this sort of interest of the Acland family, this sort of relatively early interest of the family in the preservation of land continues, but it does so within a context in which they had to operate in a similar way to other landed estates. The one thing that they had to sell a load of property in 1990 when Charles Acland died in order to meet the changing circumstances of taxation regimes after World War I. This is very common, and I think it's misunderstood by many historians and other commentators. It is not the sort of great flight of the aristocracy, their eldest sons cut down on the battlefield of World War I. It is really to rationalise their assets and to raise enough money to meet death duties and the other tax commitments in the era after World War I, when land values had gone up and this stuff was worth selling for the first time. So, in common with many other families, the Actons sell part of their estate, certainly not all of it. They had about 32,000 acres in total before 1980, and they sell a large proportion of their Somerset estates, invest the money in government stock, which is not sort of tax and capital gains, things like that period. And so that's how they continue. That's why Francis is sitting there listening to Lloyd George saying it would be nice to get rid of landed estates in 1925. But in 1944, as Nicholson has pointed out, Richard Acton gives the estate an 8,000 acres to the National Trust. And that process is decisive, as we'll see in a moment, because it deals with one of the gaps in most legislation, certainly up until 1953, which is that it provides this liability with assets to preserve it. And as we'll see, the main issue of this movement in the first decade of the 20th century, first and second decade of the 20th century, was in many respects to rip apart historic monuments from the previous asset base that had maintained them. So you end up with a load of liabilities looking for people to support them, without the landed estates that went with them, because these are carved up piecemeal and sold off. So Killerton goes into the House of National Trust. It survives its time as a board of residence for St Luke's College, but only just. People climbing around the library without touching the floor and things like that. And it shows that, in a sense, the key decisive moment was to preserve the estate as a going concern. The National Trust facilitates that, legislation goes with that, but in a sense, that decision deals with the gap in much of the early 20th century legislation. It's a less happy story with their neighbours. This is Polesmore House just outside Exeter. It went underwent a series of sort of refurbishments which show, in a sense, right up to this period just how much, like why shouldn't they, as their house, how much these houses were changed and altered. The wing on the end there was built in 1908. They decided to put in central heating, a ballroom, electric light, new water supply, Chinese bill and so on. And at the same time, on the same day that Francis Acton was saying, wouldn't it be lovely if we were taxed out of existence, the estate steward is writing to Lord Polesmore complaining about this precious radical socialist finance. Okay, so you have a different political atmosphere at Polesmore. But the Polesmore situation, in a sense, follows that of the Actons to some degree. This is Polesmore House in 1921. This is from the sale catalogue. I'm very pleased with the photograph on the left there, which shows a 1908 radiator for those any central heating enthusiasts in the audience. Major. And the gardens and so on. So it was in 1921. It was in tip-top condition. It had large amounts of money spent on it in the previous 15 years. It was ripe for sale, but it was sold because what was viable in 1908 was no longer viable even really in 1910, let alone in 1919. They had about 19,000 acres. It was valued at £313,000, total income of about £18,000 a year. But with death duties, mortgages, legacies, and so on, what was a £2,000 surplus in about 1908 had become a £2,000 deficit with various other liabilities in 1920. So this is the reason that they sold. They were otherwise solvent. They were selling a portion of their estate, actually the portion that was in the south of the county. It wasn't near where their main household was, so it was viable for sale, and that's what they did. But the valuer observed that the two white elephants at Polesmore are the house and the pleasure grounds. 90 years of history should not prove him wrong on all of that. The reason, of course, that they were white elephants was because they were ripped from the asset base that was supporting them. You see? So we have these two estates, one going one way, one going the other. They tried to sell it off to this chap, and it was suggested that the market solution could be that it becomes a family seat, a residential hotel, club, school, hydro, hospital, whatever. It eventually becomes a school, and then it becomes a hospital, and then it becomes an NHS hospital, and then a private hospital, NHS hospital, and so on. And then, after all of that, it becomes a ruin. Okay, this is Polesmore House today. That's the 1908 ballroom on the left there. That's the bit they set fire to in 1987 to try and claim on insurance. That's on the left there is the operating theatre, and the other is the tin roof. So we have two different trajectories coming out of 1913. The key things are that where estates were left with a core of with a load of assets that supported them, then they remained viable, even surviving corporate solutions imposed by the National Trust. Where properties lacked those, their histories became unstable and uncertain, and they fell into a number of different uses of mixed private and public institutional uses, but dependent upon the vagaries of funding in those two regimes. So I just wanted to give a sense of the wider context of 1913, and then the way that some of those other push factors have affected the trajectories of development over the succeeding century.
Thanks very much. I won't have any illustrations, so if you want to contemplate these comparative studies across Europe. Right, that's good. I just want to really focus on the journey of heritage protection rather than the genesis of the 1913 Act. And in the process, I want to draw attention to two fundamental principles that underline all the ancient monument legislation from 1882 onward. One of them we've already had emphasised, which is that the scheduling of individual monuments was only applied to uninhabited buildings. The other theme of mine is that the scheduling was a power that was strictly reserved to central government. And really it was through the medium of the Planning Acts that things slowly began to change. Inhabited buildings were first offered protection under the 1932 Planning Act. That introduced the power for local authorities to impose building preservation orders on, and I quote from the Act, buildings of architectural, historic or artistic interest. They could impose a building preservation order to prevent proposals for their total demolition. It was a singularly ineffective measure because the owners were to be fully recompensed for any loss of value that resulted from the imposition of a BPO. And in any case, there was no procedure in place to identify which buildings were of interest. And it's not surprising that in the event, no orders under the Act were successfully made. The Second World War changed that. The devastation, I think, led to a tentative step towards remedying some of those deficiencies. The 1944 Town and Country Planning Act gave the Minister the power to compile or approve lists of special architectural and historic interests. They dropped the artistic bit. And the demolition trigger was extended to include alterations which would seriously affect the character of these buildings. And owners now had to serve notice of their intention to a local authority so that the local authority could consider whether to impose a BPO to prevent the works. The 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, of course, considerably strengthened these measures. First of all, it made the compilation of lists mandatory. Under the 1944 Act, it was voluntary, and it was an option that hadn't been implemented. And the 1947 Act also removed the compensation clause from BPOs, although the owner could still serve a compulsory purchase order on the local authority. But at least relevant buildings were now being identified. albeit at a painfully slow process that was completed for the whole country until 1969. But the only protection for the buildings that were listed was still the service of a BPO. And anyone who has been involved in a BPO, this was a very complex, a very protracted procedure. It involved the service of a notice of intent that gave the local planning authority 6 months' notice to decide whether to prevent the works. And the only way they could do this was by serving a building preservation order. That preservation order then had to be examined as a public inquiry before being ratified. And it's very small wonder that most local authorities were extremely reluctant to exercise the power. By 1964, only 344 BPOs had been confirmed. There was a notable exception to this, and that was the London County Council. They set up an historic buildings division within their architects department. And under the very able direction of W.M. Eden, the work of the division greatly expanded following the foundation of the GLC in 1966. It was really one of the very few local authorities which was not daunted by the BPO system. And indeed, it employed a small team of historians whose primary function was to provide the historical evidence that could be presented at public inquiry to support the case for preservation. I started my own professional career as one of those privileged historians. And such was the quality of our work, Frank Kelsall in the audience will agree with me, that over 90% of the BPOs imposed by the GLC were successfully upheld. The next stage in the legislative process was the 1967 Civic Amenities Act. That was notable for a fundamental change in the designation regime. Because it delegated to local authorities the exclusive power which hitherto had been exercised only by central government, that power to identify those heritage assets, in modern jargon, which were worthy of protection. I suppose in an age of localism that might not seem a radical step, but 50 years ago it was a remarkable loosening of central control. The Act actually imposed a duty on local planning authorities to, from time to time, determine those areas which were of special architectural or historic interest, and I quote, the character or appearance of which is desirable to preserve or enhance, and to designate them as conservation areas. The machinery for designation was left entirely at a local level, and unlike listing, didn't require the authorization of the Secretary of State. That's a radical change. In itself, the Act didn't impose any significant extra control, but all of that was changed in the following year with the 1968 Town and Country Planning Act. If the 1913 Ancient Monuments Act was the major catalyst for the protection of uninhabited structures, the 1968 Act was of similar significance for all the rest. By introducing the concept of listed building consent, it totally reversed the responsibility for change or demolition. Instead of simply giving notice of intent, the owner now had to seek specific permission for any works, and in the process had to provide justification. And instead of the last resort negativity of the BPO, the local authority was given the positive opportunity to negotiate acceptable proposals. Moderated by the appeal system, local authorities were now in a position to determine applications on their own. Although, of course, final decisions on Grade 1 and Grade 2 star buildings still remained with the Secretary of State. The Act also gave teeth to locally designated conservation areas by the parallel concept of conservation area consent for the total or partial demolition of unlisted buildings in a conservation area. And the accompanying circular of 61-68 introduced that all-important presumption in favour of preservation, a presumption that we clung on to by the skin of our teeth. It was a remarkable boost to the nascent conservation movement. And the new raft of heritage responsibilities encouraged a number of local authorities to follow the lead of the GLC and set up specialised departments to deal with these new responsibilities. Some like Essex and Hampshire ensured that they were adequately staffed to play a very dynamic, proactive role. There were others like Buckinghamshire and Derbyshire and so on, which relied on single specialised officers, and there were some, like Oxfordshire, which harnessed the expertise of county historical societies and made no staff appointments of their own. The new title of Conservation Officer gained currency. It was used to describe these local authority professionals. And these professionals came from a variety of different disciplines: architecture, town planning, history, archaeology, history of art, and so on. A significant number had been trained in the GLC, and I think the Historic Buildings Division there acted as a kind of a academy in the field. Scattered widely, with intermittent coverage over the whole country, it was hardly a coherent profession, but it began to establish a network of common interests, sometimes through coming together for education. The Institute of Advanced Architectural Studies at York ran a whole series of short courses which brought people from all over the country to study specific elements of the heritage. And in London, there was the Diploma in the Conservation of Historical Monuments, which had been established by W.A. Eden, largely to train his own staff at the Institute of Archaeology with Professor Grimes. The demand for conservation professionals was then given a major impetus by the reorganisation of local government in 1974. This handed development control responsibilities to the new district councils. And the number of local authorities needing conservation expertise increased exponentially. And it was a period of comparative economic stability. Most of those local authorities responded by establishing specialised posts. A further boost was given by European Architectural Heritage Year the following year, 1975. That stimulated popular interest in conservation. It also led to the establishment of the Architectural Heritage Fund, which supported local trusts who used revolving funds to rescue threatened buildings and then sell them onto the open market. And that proved to be a very successful initiative at first, and a number of these trusts were directly initiated by local authorities. And inevitably, this increased the employment opportunities for those seeking a career in heritage conservation. And the profession was further enhanced by two new developments in the early 1980s. The relisting survey, which was initiated by Michael Esselty in 1982, was largely carried out by private consultants. And those consultants hired an army of new investigators on short-term contracts, and many of those then went on to work for local authorities who required more officers to deal with the vastly increased number of listed buildings that resulted from the resurvey. And the other change in the 80s was on the 1st of April 1984, that auspicious date when English heritage was founded. And that brought new standards of professionalism to the field. And those standards, I think, spread out across the whole country. From the very outset, English Heritage adopted an advocacy role. Unlike its civil service predecessor at the Department of the Environment, it directly engaged with local authority officers. Officers who were working on the ground in a real attempt to ensure consistency in decision making and change from civil service inspectors not conversing with local authority conservation officers to English heritage officers actually establishing relationships for a common cause was a major change. The essential training for this new generation of conservation professionals was partly provided on the job, but increasingly it led to the establishment of new postgraduate qualifications in historic conservation set up by the universities. The short courses at York were repackaged as a master's degree. The old diploma at the Institute of Archaeology was transferred to the Architectural Association, where it found a new constituency of mid-career professionals. The RICS set up its distance learning degree in historic conservation at Reading University, and then new master's level courses at a number of institutes around the country. Oxford Brookes in partnership with Oxford University, Bristol, Bath, Bournemouth, Plymouth, De Montfort, and so on. Ironbridge, with a degree that was validated by Birmingham University. And there were others. It soon became a crowded marketplace. And some of those degrees have inevitably fallen by the wayside. But others continue to flourish, many of them bolstered by the enhanced fees provided by global demand. Increasingly, their graduates are finding employment in private consultancies rather than the traditional career routes in local authorities and English heritage, where sadly the opportunities are shrinking. But the net result, I think, has been the emergence of a dedicated conservation profession. A profession that was given a structure by the establishment of the Institute of Historic Building Conservation in 1997. This had its origins in the Association of Conservation Officers, which had been set up as long ago as 1981, largely at the initiative of Michael Pearce of Hampshire County Council and Peter Richards of Essex County Council. So the drive was coming from local authorities, and as its name implies, that association was initially founded to provide a forum and a voice for those who were working in local authorities. Its transformation into a proper institute, embracing all the built environment professions across the public, private and voluntary sectors, with very rigorous standards of admission, with a very strong code of professional conduct and a mandatory obligation of CPD. I think it's a measure of how far we've come on that journey of heritage protection. Certainly since the opportunities which were opened up by the 1968 Act. It would be wrong to be complacent, particularly in the economic climate, which, as seen as a recent survey published only last week, has shown a 33% fall in local authority conservation specialists since 2006. That's a very worrying trend. But the sheer amount of professional knowledge that is available to the decision-making process at a local and a national level is, I think, a remarkable testament to the effectiveness of what Alan Powers labelled a few years ago the heroic period of conservation. Even if it's a testimony to an effectiveness that our political masters still seem strangely reluctant to recognise. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to our four speakers. In just over an hour, we've been on a journey of heritage protection that's taken us from the 1880s through to the 1970s. It seems to me that at least four big themes have emerged out of Simon's keynote in those four papers. We've heard about the legislative environment, question of whether and why some political contexts have produced been more sympathetic and favourable to heritage protection than others, how economic forces, particularly forces in the countryside, have had consequences for what cultural assets require some sort of intervention if they're to be preserved. We've also been hearing about the impetus for legislation, the extent to which today's legislation, if you like, has an eye on the past in terms of addressing the deficiencies or difficulties of previous legislation, as much as it has an eye to the future, and the question of whether stimulus to that legislation has often come from abroad in terms of international competition and rivalry, it's a scramble for heritage rather than scramble for colonies, if you like. Thirdly, we've been hearing about the purview of our legislators, what you might call heritage as selective gaze, why certain types of architecture and certain periods of the past seem to loom more large in the heritage debate at some times than others, and where the historical emphasis comes to light at any one time. And then finally, those questions that over the last century legislators have struggled and grappled with. And here we've been hearing, I think, as much about the setting of limits on the state's role as the expansion of the role of government. And maybe one question that's as pertinent and pregnant now as it was a century ago: how is a public interest in privately owned heritage to be maintained? So lots of themes, I think, emerging across the four papers and keynotes, but over to you for some questions and comments. Do we have a roving remarks on that, Kristen? So we have one right in the back left-hand corner. You can start there. As you ask your question, please could you give your name and say which organisation you're from or represent?
I can probably do this without a microphone.
Great.
I'm Chris Stoll from Cardiff University. What I wanted to do really was thank Astra for her contribution. And to note, really, the similarities that seem to be faced in regard to issues of political traction in the first period of the century, the similarities of the situation we see now, and to know the interest of the rhetorical strategies adopted, in particular this move away from advocating general cultural benefits towards more specific and harder business commercial benefits, are ones which we've gone through in the 1990s and 2000s, and we may usefully perhaps look back and see how that failed or succeeded or did not succeed in the early 20th century. The other point I took from what you said was this the rhetoric about things are better elsewhere. Now, of course, this argument is used to offset any number of political agendas throughout time. You only have to think today of the current debate in education and in health, for example. And although very useful as a rhetorical tool, of course, very often based on evidence that is at best anecdotal. And the point that I just wanted to draw from that, because it's so important and so fundamental, particularly for this gathering, particularly with HRC and the colleagues involved, is that advocacy of that sort of anecdotal, may well give you the short-term gain, may take you over, that is to the third that may give attention. But in order to have sustained effective policy, sustained effective implementation, you've absolutely got to have a robust evidence base, and you've absolutely got to have ongoing developing, continuing, robust understanding, which means that infrastructure of understanding research is absolutely critical to ongoing effective cultural heritage management, cultural conservation. And to me, that's perhaps one of those important things which I would like to see develop and sustain as a theme coming out of this gathering. That's all I can say.
Probably just one thing. I certainly stress the fact that the foreign models are used as a rhetorical device. I think it's important, but there also was real emulation in the sense that in some ways the global rule also was about what worked and what didn't work, and that some of these priorities changed. But what we can see is a real mixture of ideas. And I think in many ways the same is still going on, and that now just the roles have been reversed in the sense that the strength of the voluntary sector in Britain is largely emulated abroad rather than the states were here.
Thank you. I'm Rosemary Hill. I'm an independent scholar and of the Society of Antiquaries and a trustee of the Victorian Society. And I want to take Ben Cowell up. I also wrote a book about Stonehenge. I wanted to take you up on the page about Corsair and Downshifts, who always gets it in the neck. Partly just out of historical justice, among the things that she stopped the public from doing was turning up with their own hammers to take bits off Stonehenge, sliding down the stones, and so forth. The architecture interventions he did sponsor, which was extraordinarily imaginative. He was a great supporter of SPAB principles, so he would only have things propped up. Among the examples of help that he rejected during his tenureship, the idea of building a ditch, digging a ditch all around it, policeman's cottage, and stone over the centre. Of course, once he did go into public hands, the Society of Antiquaries got in there. The resulting dig, Christian Liddell described as having destroyed half of Stonehenge. It was also when it came to public ownership that the real fighting started, Druids behaving irresponsibly at the solstice, and of course under English heritage, as many of us remember, it got very heavy indeed, and it was an exclusion zone. So all of this is partly, as I say, to put Edward Douglas' point of view. He was actually a very good and responsible custodian, albeit a slightly ordinary man. But the larger point, I think, is that as we are all facing economic challenges, political indifference over the last 2 or 3 governments, there's not been much support. There is a quite proper tendency for us all to stick together. And I'm glad of that. But I think it's also very important for us to keep on remembering to have a discussion, a critical discussion amongst ourselves, and not to think public ownership, good, conservation, all I'm saying. And keep pushing the case in as many varied forms as we can.
Thank you. Well, firstly, thank you very much, and I bow to your deep knowledge of this topic, Rosemary, and quail at the thought of responding. Anybody decent about Stonehenge, you tend to say that I absolutely agree with the point you're making. The point is that private owners are so critical to heritage, to its protection, have been all along. So I suppose I was trying to warn against putting the National Trust into a particular box, and I did the opposite, and exactly the same thing to the private owner in this case, and of course that was wrong, so you can that. I suppose the point, I use the example because it did provoke such an over the issue of protection versus access, and Hunter was such an expert on the question of access, and the issue of access to open land, to common land, footpath access were just such there was such a strong current of political activity around the 1860s and 1870s, and so much of what we think of as the genesis of heritage protection was about open spaces protection. So that was the other little point I wanted to make, because a lot of this was coming out of groups like the Commons Preservation Society in particular, and that example seemed to hit the heritage of a natural writing versus heritage of a built-up writing.
against it. So that's the right reason I used it.
Stonehenge is always the perfect illustration of every debate.
Is there a question over here?
Thank you, Matthew Sullivan from SPAB. This morning's talk were all fascinating, but no one so far has really touched on the situation of the church. We had almost simultaneously with the 1913 Act the rise of diocesan advisory bodies, but the church seemed rather unique in having retained its exemption throughout the period since, where almost all other groups of society have been subject to heritage laws. So, the question for the panel is, what's so special about the church that it's in this position? And also perhaps for Astrid, are we very unique in this? You know, does the rest of Europe do things in the same way as far as the church is concerned?
I'll very briefly answer your first question, Matthew. It's the power of the bishops in the House of Lords.
And yes, we are unique in this. In the rest of Europe, it's very much about who has the control about religion versus the control about church property. And preservation becomes the prime locus to act out these broader culture wars. But I also think the fact that at a moment when everywhere else in Europe commissions were set up in the 1840s, nothing happened on the part of the state, but the church set up its own restoration machinery. So in some ways there was an institution in place that was working and that nobody else was touching.
I'd like to just stick with that. That's quite a big issue, I think, with ecclesiastical buildings, and see if anyone else wants to come on that side.
Only really to say that, as Matthew knows, the word exemption is not really very accurate, because now speaking as a member of the Parochial Church Council and as a fabric officer, I can tell you I would infinitely prefer to be under the secular system than the church system, which doesn't feel like an exemption at all. It is the most invasive, intrusive, petty-fogging, meddling system you could ever imagine. So I actually think that, they want to debate further, but I don't think that the church is exempt in any sense. It has created its own system, which is, I think, more onerous than the state system.
Anyone want to ask, make another comment on ecclesiastical building before it gets over there?
It's been true with Churches Conservation Trust. In terms of the history, of course, in 1969 there was a unique partnership between the church and the state, which created a new charity, the Redundant Churches Fund, now Church Conservation Trust. And actually that was a very unusual situation, something that would not happen now. It's obviously saved 344 buildings in the last count.
And there was another question in the middle.
Frank Kelson, One Architectural History Practice. This is really the historical part of these 2 days. Can anybody answer the blunt question, which is, when was the phrase historic environment first coined? Because what we've heard this morning is a group of people from all sorts of different backgrounds, a wide range of what was interest, so that when, for instance, Prosper Mérimée visited many cathedrals in France, England was still in the prehistoric monuments. But most particularly within the British context, the way in which we still haven't quite reached any sort of unified idea of what the historic environment is. Looking back over the time that I've been active in it, I can remember just about Richard Crossan grabbing the historic buildings powers of the 1953 Act from the Office of Works to the Ministry of Housing and Local Government. Then they were unified in theory with the creation of the Department of the Environment. But when English Heritage took over in 1984, It still had an ancient monuments division, a historic areas division, a historic buildings division, a chief inspector division. It was really only in 1992 that the heritage grappled with that problem and tried to establish some sort of unified idea of what was the historic environment. And we still have an Institute of Historic Buildings Conservation and an Institute of Field Archaeologists.
So a question about the language and vocabulary of heritage protection and what that signifies. Ben, would you like to comment?
I believe the earliest I think I've seen it is it David Baker in 1981 called the Historic Environment, which I think is the earliest I've seen of it. Others may have other ideas, but of course you speak to the fact that these phrases, on the one hand, used to be focused in mind, on the other hand, set up divisions and silos which can be quite helpful. I suppose the genius, as I would put it, of the National Trust Act was that it was written in such a way as to be quite open-ended. Places of historic interest and natural beauty was the formulation of words there, which perhaps means that our meaning extends as much to the Big Brother house as to other books.
Okay, we've got one in the middle and one in front.
Thanks. Paul Bassett from University College London. Wanted to pick up on a couple of points made in both Simon and Astrid's papers, but also to pose a question to Astrid. So there's a simple question to ask to Astrid, which perhaps you can come back to in our later point, which is about actually within that big comparative project that you described, did, for instance, in the British context then in 1913, was were clauses or was the foreign legislation actually meaningful in terms of were clauses incorporated into the British law, for instance? And the bigger question, I think, relates to the importance of looking at the colonial or imperial context, because, again, we're framing everything rather on a national kind of or in some cases a competitive national kind of framework. But one of the interesting things that when one looks at the interface between, say, what was happening in England and what was happening in the British colonies, for instance, where again you get this kind of interface, which is sometimes mediated by the Colonial Office, sometimes by other organisations such as the British Museum and so on. It relates partly to Curzon, of course, because, as is well rehearsed often, Curzon kind of experimented with heritage legislation in India, where the issues of private property were not there. So I was very interested in Simon's point earlier, as an arch Tory, standing up for private property in the British context, whereas of course he argued precisely the opposite in India, arguing for the civilised nature of the British Empire, for the fact that the state actually intervened. Of course he didn't have much opposition. So it's also interesting to look, for instance, in Cyprus. So you mentioned the kind of Ottoman laws that were relevant there. And it's interestingly where the kind of principles of conservation meet the kind of realpolitik, I suppose, because of course it was the British Museum which then wanted to resist the amendment of heritage law because, quote, it would be inconvenient, of course, to people who were engaged in the excavation. So I think that point that you kind of mentioned about portable antiquities and, of course, monuments, there's a very interesting relationship in there, which partly is played out in this kind of colonial context, where you have rather compromised competing interests from people, who are arguing one thing in one domain and another in another.
Yes, clauses are often directly translated. In the British case, it's more that the principles are used, especially the idea of commission, the idea of scheduling. At the time, we used the word classement generally, because it's a French one and the French principle. So that gets directly translated into the text. There are other cases, for example, in Prussia, the French Act is just simply translated and then it was used. So there is very direct emulation here. With regard to the colonial context, it's true that generally legislation is much more far-reaching in the colonial context. Also because of different situations. In Malta, for example, the state actually owns all the ecclesiastical building that used to belong to the Knights of St. John. So here we have, all of a sudden the state being part of Catholic churches. But then also usually the earlier laws are kept in place in Cyprus, but the same is, for example, in Tunisia, where legislation then is kept by the French and enhanced. What is interesting in this debate of which ones are good modules, it's often difficult to use colonial legislation in the metropoles, because they seem to be done for a different context. But what often happens is that the colonial legislation of one country gets adopted in the metropolitan context somewhere else. For example, the French are very interested in Curzon's legislation in India, adopt that, and then the British are interested by the French law, who has been inspired by Curzon's legislation in France. So it's really a circular way of exchanging ideas and different clauses.
I'm Matthew Gregory from Newcastle University. In all of those 4 papers, there's lots of fascinating detail about the wrangles between the various stakeholders involved, whether it's government or the National Trust or the learned societies or the landowners. But I was wondering about the role of public opinion in all of that. Now, I was just thinking, in short, is public opinion before or in advance of they're the same things? It's before or after the legislation is coming out? Are they when government legislation is coming out, when the Passing Laws Committee is sitting, is it following general opinions in the population that only heritage before about 1700 counts as heritage? Or what about trips? Are there lots of day trips? Are there lots of school trips? Are there lots of local societies which are visiting these places? When 72 Dean Street is up for demolition, are there queues around the block, or is it just a couple of letters to the Times? I'm just wondering about the relationship between all of those stakeholders you're talking about and public opinion.
Yeah, whether it's in advance or behind, it's very difficult. But there are a number of triggers that change public opinion, and they're usually what are seen as disasters at the time, but they have a beneficial effect. The demolition of the Euston Arch totally changed public opinion, I think. The demolition of the Firestone factory had a similar impact for 20th century buildings, and in a sense one could almost say that the beneficial outcome of these dreadful acts of vandalism has far surpassed the importance of those buildings. But it has helped to shift public opinion. The sort of work that English Heritage did over the last 10 years to demonstrate the economic importance of our cultural heritage has totally failed to change political opinion, but I suspect it's changing public opinion.
I think the other thing just to add is what's come out of Simon Thurley's book as well is who is the public, that the public changes over time. So the example that Malcolm was talking about there, you've got a much larger, in a sense, body of opinion that's being influenced. In 1913, I suppose they are people we would call today the opinion formers, really. That's, in a sense, the public that matters because they have action on the sort of legislation. I think it's much more difficult to get why, because they're clearly there, and there's clearly things that come up around commons and commons preservation and so on. But I think that one of the other things perhaps that we ought to think about is, in a sense, when we're thinking about a public audience, the nature of that audience changes in the 20th century. There's a kind of feedback between the legislation and then, if you like, a greater concern of different groups of activists being formed through that period.
Do you have a question? We have lots of questions, but I'll try and take them in the order that you put your hands up. We have one at the back of the room and then a cluster over here.
Peter Coates, Bristol University. I was wondering whether any of the speakers had any thoughts on the role of American influence. I was thinking specifically of the Antiquities Act of 1906, an enormously powerful piece of federal legislation that empowered the president to protect lands of natural and cultural value such as Grand Canyon, Devil's Town, Wyoming, and so forth. Is the impact of this American initiative evident, whether in Britain or elsewhere in Europe?
Thank you, Peter. I'll go first. If only to say that I think this is obviously an international discussion that's happening, conversations happening at that time about how to protect monuments, places, and landscapes. And in relation to the trust, the national trust, the interesting conversation that is happening across the Atlantic is when, I think in the early 1890s, some of the ideas that Robert Hunter had been talking about and Warnes had been talking about is sort of taken across the Atlantic to America, where I think the Boston Trustees of Reservations is established on similar principles to the principles that the founders of the National Trust were talking about. So if you like, that was we weren't the first National Trust model to be set up. It was set up first in America, I guess what became the National Parks movement eventually. And others have been more detailed than me about that.
There certainly is a very strong transatlantic exchange, and it's mostly in Britain that American legislation is read much more than on the continent. There's interest in nature protection, but I think there also is a certain amount of snobbery that they don't have heritage, they don't have culture, they don't have artifacts in America that you can see in a lot of continental texts.
Peter Mandler over here, and then there's a few.
I don't think I need the microphone. Peter Mandler from Cambridge. I just wanted to take up that very interesting question that was asked about public opinion and connect it to an earlier question about environment. I mean, of course, as was rightly said on the panel, it's very hard to differentiate public opinion, grassroots public opinion, from the careful work that interest groups and lobby groups do, like those represented in this room, which always, of course, hope to speak to the public and sometimes manage to get away with it. But I just wanted to point to two moments where I think there was a genuine unorganized groundswell which did affect the pace of conservation legislation. One was right after the Second World War, around 1950, when the discovery of this Hebraic temple in the city of London unleashed an enormous amount of unorganized public interest, and that was one of the very few, and certainly one of the first occasions where crowds did form, and spontaneously pretty much, and watched an archaeological dig at work. I mean, it helped that it was in the middle of the most populated city in the country, but and it also, I think, helped to establish in political circles that this modernization or reconstruction project that was getting underway in the early 50s was not incompatible with, and indeed might go hand in hand with, a care for the heritage. So I think that had an effect on both parties. The other surge in public opinion, more or less unorganized and spontaneous, was precisely around the concept of the environment. And this springs up in the early 60s, which is when the environment begins to be used in the modern sense. Not just the historic environment, the natural environment as well. And of course it's linked to the burgeoning counterculture, and it's what made John Betjeman a hero of hippies. I think, again, that acquires a kind of impetus of its own and persuades politicians and interest groups that actually there is some new cultural force behind them, which they need to harness. I mean, that's what Betjeman did so cleverly. He decided, even though these are people not very much like him, he's going to take advantage of them, and they forged a very effective alliance. And I think, for instance, the disputes over some of the very famous heritage incidents like the Euston Arch in the early 60s are actually benefiting from that growing countercultural sympathy for preservation of the environment rather than vice versa.
We have quite a few more questions over here.
I was just going to add a comment to what Peter said. Let me use the microphone, please. Just a comment to what Peter Mandler just said. I can remember the public inquiry on the buildings which were eventually demolished by just opposite the Wellington Arch. which were occupied by hippies, and there were large placards written across those buildings at one time, "We are the writing on your wall."
Now, we're getting to the point where it's probably the last few questions. So I'm going to suggest that we take sort of 3 questions together and let the panel respond. So I know Nizam and Richard want to ask questions, and then somebody right at the back there. So.
Thank you, Andrew. Sam Gibson from University of Leicester. I'm in a school of museum studies, so I'm possibly coming to this from it's interesting how different our focus is on museum studies and the debates in museums of the last 20 years. I was really interested in the legislative history and professional histories that you were describing for us there. And one of the things that I was really struck by, many of you were talking about the sort of dichotomy between notions of access and notions of protection, and this drive that meant that it was only really the state that could perhaps facilitate both access and protection. The thing that really struck me was that the access that you were talking about in that history was an access that was about collecting the landscape or collecting the building. And the access that we increasingly, well certainly in museums anyway, and I think it's fair to say in heritage, certainly English heritage over the last 10 years, HLF, National Trust, the access that we talk about now is about intellectual and emotional access. And it's that kind of access that enables us to broaden our audiences and perhaps to give us the kind of groundswell of public opinion that we need to generate in order to get the state perhaps more behind the need to spend some money on heritage, which seems to be declining at the moment. And I wondered if any of you had any reflections on that changing notion of access over the last sort of 100 years, really.
Richard, can we take more questions as well, please?
Mine is not a question. It's a footnote. And if you're pushed for time, you may want to pass to the next question.
There's one right at the back now.
Rachel Green, Westminster City Council. The question I wanted to put was really about the fact that when we're talking about national legislation, we now have, all these UNESCO, we have the issue of World Heritage Sites, where suddenly within the UK we have 4 instances, one which affects my World Heritage Site, Westminster, there's also the Tower of London. We also see what's happening in Liverpool, where we now having to see what might happen with Giant's Causeway in Ireland. And I thought what was quite interesting was the fact that here we've got, at the moment, within the national legislations, we have the national government in the sense, and then locally those being administered. And here we have individual administrations, and in fact, the localism actually might be going even to a lower level of people making decisions, and yet it looks like we're going to judge internationally in this instance as to whether the standards that this government is adopted are appropriate. And I'm just interested therefore in the sense the international movement and the international review that this might be about.
Thank you.
As far as World Heritage Sites are concerned, what really disturbing is that this country can totally ignore the comments, and so that Liverpool and the Tower of London and the Giant's Causeway can go ahead. And so we have this international standard which we are totally ignoring.
But it might be worth remembering that the drive to national legislation was also always a drive towards international legislation. If we look at these origins of the 1913 Act, the same antagonists were very often involved in setting up something like UNESCO. It wasn't the political circumstances globally for it, but there already was this move to have it through private organizations.
These sort of last comments, as it were, from the panel. I suppose both of those questions were about the state and different ways in which the state intervenes or has a role in protection of heritage. And I suppose one thing we haven't really discussed in our questions, but perhaps will be a backdrop to the rest of the conference, is
We heard a lot this morning about the state collecting monuments, collecting sites, in other words, directly owning bits of heritage in order to protect it, alongside the work of private owners and charities and so on. The changes to English heritage, if I may drop that in, suggest a kind of different way of doing things, and where that ownership may remain vested in the state, but the day-to-day maintenance of those assets will be done differently in an independent charitable context. And the question might be, what difference will that make, if any, to protection and indeed this notion of the role of the state as a collector of assets? And maybe something that will, I'm sure, come up over the course of the 2 days.
Just reflecting on the question, the first question, really, which was to think about people's emotional involvement, or the way that audiences now invest their own interest in a lot of these things. And I think we've seen, both in the sort of museum sector and also in the way that many of historic houses, buildings, and others have presented in the last 30 years, this desire to sort of dismantle the idea of the expert just simply presenting something that is the authorised version, and you take it or leave it. And I think there's been a lot of work working with National Trust and the things that I've been involved with in my sort of small way, with Baltimore, where a lot of the emphasis has been on other sorts of conservation, where you get local groups involved, because they have an investment in the locality. And that, in a sense, is the parallel with that is sort of nature conservation, isn't it? The most recent thinking on that is if local groups are not involved in the state, is never going to win, in a sense. And I think the same, to some degree, is true of the heritage sector as well.
Well, lunch beckons, but before we let you go for lunch, can I draw your attention? You should all have a postcard on the front of the conference folder. The observant among you will have registered that that's not my image on the front, but in fact one of Mary the First. But what we're hoping for is to get you all to fill these out today. And the questions that we've set are the top challenges and priorities for heritage protection over the coming decades, and what would be the most important or appropriate response. And if you can fill those out today, it would be tremendously helpful. We're going to gather them from you, and then we're going to play your views and opinions back into the final session tomorrow on the future of heritage protection. So if I could ask your cooperation in doing that. Can I just check with the organisers, where are we then handing these cards back to the front desk of reception, please. Lunch is going to be served directly in the room where we served coffee and tea this morning. It would be very helpful if everybody could be back in here and seated by 1:45, please, so we can keep the schedule, because we have the debate in the evening later on, and we want to make sure that we leave plenty of time for you to travel from here to Reba. But before we finish, could you join me in thanking the speakers again?